17-ton John Deere 8R tractor sat silent in the cornfield for 11 days, $500,000 of green steel, holding up a $250,000 harvest. Jane Nelson, the new mechanic they'd relegated to oil changes, asked to examine the machine. Minutes later, Vaughn, the operations manager, arrived. When he saw her standing there with a diagnostic tablet, he exploded. "You can't!" The 5 mechanics watched uncomfortably as he ridiculed her mercilessly. "Stick to what you know, sweetheart, changing oil while the real mechanics work." But when Jane connected her tablet to the tractor's computer and pulled up error codes everyone had dismissed, the laughter stopped. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cornfield. Jane Nelson stood beside the John Deere 8R, the most expensive piece of equipment on the co-op. 17 tons of green metal with the hood raised, engine exposed. Her hands gripped a diagnostic tablet with the ease of someone who'd spent a decade troubleshooting engines. The gray coveralls were still clean. They only gave her oil changes, not real diagnostic work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Behind her, 5 mechanics stood with wrenches in calloused hands, watching with barely concealed skepticism. A woman, with a computer, claiming she could fix what they couldn't. Jane Nelson hadn't always been the woman relegated to oil changes and tire rotations. 20 years ago, she'd been a 7-year-old girl with grease under her fingernails, sitting on a rolling stool in her grandfather's John Deere dealership in Cedar Rapids. Walter Nelson had owned Nelson Agricultural Equipment for 32 years, and the service bays had been Jane's second home. While other kids played with dolls, Jane handed her grandfather socket wrenches and learned the difference between a fuel injector and a carburetor. "Engines talk to you if you listen," Walter used to say, wiping his hands on a red shop rag that lived in his back pocket. "They tell you what's wrong. You just have to pay attention." She'd paid attention. Every Saturday morning through middle school and high school, Jane was there, watching, learning, asking questions that made the older mechanics smile. By 15, she could diagnose a failing alternator by sound alone. By 17, she was rebuilding small engines in Walter's workshop while her classmates were at football games. Technical school came at 19. Jane enrolled in the Agricultural Equipment Systems program at Hawkeye Community College, one of 3 women in a class of 47. She graduated top of her class 2 years later with honors, a certification portfolio that impressed every instructor, and a burning desire to work on the massive machines that fed the world. Combines, tractors, harvesters, the equipment that turned dirt into dinner for millions. But Walter died during her second year. Heart attack in the service bay, surrounded by the machines he'd loved his entire life. The dealership went to his son, Jane's uncle, who sold it within 6 months to a regional chain. The family legacy disappeared into corporate paperwork. At 21, Jane opened Nelson Small Engine Repair in a rented garage bay. Lawnmowers, ATVs, generators, small tractors, anything she could get her hands on. 8 years of building a reputation, one satisfied customer at a time. 8 years of proving she knew what she was doing. 8 years of success. The shop turned a modest profit. She had regulars who trusted her, who brought their equipment to the Nelson girl instead of the chain stores. She was respected, established, safe. But every time a farmer brought in a compact tractor, every time she glimpsed a John Deere 8R rolling past on a flatbed, something in her chest tightened. This wasn't what Walter had trained her for. This wasn't the dream. So 3 months ago at 29, Jane sold the business. Sold the tools, the customer list, the reputation she'd built brick by brick. She applied to Thornhill Agricultural Co-op as an equipment specialist. Her resume listed technical certifications, 8 years of business ownership, and a reference from her technical school department head. The offer letter came back with entry-level mechanic position at the top. Oil changes, tire rotations, basic maintenance. "You understand," Vaughn had said during the interview, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We need to make sure you can handle the work before we move you up." She'd accepted. Because she believed competence would speak louder than prejudice. Because she believed merit would win. 3 weeks of oil changes had taught her otherwise. Until today. Until a $500,000 tractor sat broken and she finally got her chance to show them what Walter Nelson's granddaughter could really do. Derek Vaughn had been 17 when he first walked into a farm equipment shop, and the mechanic who hired him had asked exactly one question. Can you turn a wrench? No diploma, no certifications, no computer diagnostics, just hands and willingness. 30 years later, Derek was operations manager at Thornhill Co-op, and he'd earned every promotion the old-fashioned way. He could diagnose a failing injector pump by the sound of the engine miss. He knew when a hydraulic system was starving for pressure by the way the loader arms hesitated. Real mechanics didn't need computers to tell them what their ears and hands already knew. But lately, the tractors didn't sound like anything. They were silent, except for error codes and digital readouts he couldn't interpret without manuals. The new equipment required software updates and OBD2 scanners and technicians who looked at screens instead of engine blocks. Derek watched younger mechanics, technical school graduates, plug in tablets and solve problems in minutes that would have taken him hours of methodical disassembly. He felt himself becoming obsolete, and the feeling made him mean. When Jane Nelson's application crossed his desk 3 months ago, he'd seen everything he feared. Technical certifications, computer diagnostics training, 29 years old and confident enough to call herself an equipment specialist. He'd hired her for oil changes and told himself it was about experience. But late at night, when he was honest, he knew it was about control, about keeping the world he understood from slipping away completely. Frank Thornhill watched Derek's defensiveness with growing discomfort. Frank's father, Robert, had built Thornhill Co-op on progressive principles: hire the best, treat people fairly, let merit determine advancement. But Frank had inherited during the 2008 recession, when survival meant stability, and stability meant not rocking boats. He'd let Derek run operations without interference, even when he noticed the pattern: technical school graduates stuck in entry positions while Derek's old guard mechanics advanced. Now, with an $85,000 tractor dead for 11 days and harvest deadline looming, Frank couldn't avoid the truth anymore. His father would have confronted Derek years ago. Frank had compromised values for convenience, and it was costing them more than money. Day one started with a radio call from Marcus Webb, operating the 8R in the South Field during deep tillage. Engines surging, he'd reported, voice tense. Losing power under load, now it's... The transmission cut out as the engine died completely. 17 tons of tractor sat silent in freshly turned soil, and the clock started ticking on the harvest deadline. Tom Reynolds and Carl Santos spent the first 3 days on the obvious suspects: fuel filters, clean. Injectors, firing perfectly. Air intake, unrestricted. Compression test, all cylinders within spec. The engine would start, run smoothly at idle, then die under any significant load. Textbook fuel starvation, except the fuel system checked out perfect. Days 4 through 6 brought the first expensive guess. New fuel pump installed for $285, entire fuel system flushed and cleaned. The tractor started beautifully in the shop, ran for 2 hours without complaint. Tom drove it back to the field, lowered the tillage equipment, engaged the PTO. 20 minutes later, the same surging, the same power loss, the same dead stop. Back to the shop on a flatbed. Days 7 through 9, Derek authorized the big fix: new engine control module for $350. Electronics, he declared with certainty. Always the damn computers. Same result: perfect in the shop, dead in the field. Day 10, Frank called in an outside specialist from Des Moines. The man spent 4 hours with diagnostic equipment, took compression readings, listened to the engine, and delivered his verdict: internal engine damage from overheating. You need a rebuild. The quote came back at $4,500 plus installation. Day 11, Jane was finishing an oil change on a combine in the adjacent bay when she overheard Tom and Carl discussing the symptoms for the 100th time. Runs perfect until you load it, Tom was saying. Then it just starves out. Jane set down her oil filter wrench and walked over. Did you test dynamic fuel pressure under load conditions? Derek, standing nearby with a clipboard, laughed, sharp and dismissive. We know what we're doing, honey. Why don't you get back to your oil change? Jane kept her voice professional, calm. The symptoms indicate intermittent pressure regulation, not mechanical failure. If pressure drops only under high load, enough. Derek's face flushed red. I've got 5 experienced mechanics and a certified specialist who've actually diagnosed real problems before. We don't need theories from someone who's been here 3 weeks. He pointed toward the combine. Go. Do your job. Let the real mechanics handle this. Jane returned to her bay, jaw tight, hands steady on her wrench. Behind her, she heard Carl mutter, "She might have a point about the pressure regulator." "She doesn't," Derek cut him off. End of discussion. Jane found Frank Thornhill in his office an hour later, reviewing the $4,500 rebuild quote with the expression of a man watching his margins evaporate. She knocked on the open door. "Mr. Thornhill, I need 2 minutes." Frank looked up, surprised. Before he could respond, Derek's voice came from behind her. "Frank, don't let her waste your time with technical school theories." Jane didn't turn around. "The tractor doesn't have internal engine damage. The symptom pattern indicates fuel pressure regulator failure. Intermittent pressure loss under high load that wouldn't show up in static testing." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Explain." "Modern fuel systems maintain precise pressure through electronic regulation," Jane began. "If the regulator fails partially, it compensates fine under light load, but can't maintain pressure when the engine's working hard. The diagnostic computer should have error codes stored." Derek stepped into the doorway, voice rising. "She's been here 3 weeks, Frank." 3 weeks? You can't possibly understand what 5 experienced mechanics and a certified specialist couldn't figure out." His face was crimson now, gesturing wildly. "This is exactly what's wrong with these technical school kids. All theory, no real-world experience. Maybe stick to changing oil while the real mechanics work on real problems." The shop had gone quiet. Through the office window, Jane could see Tom and Carl frozen mid-task. Kenny looked down at his workbench. Marcus suppressed a smirk. Brian simply looked away. Frank stood slowly, walked to the window, looked at the disabled tractor on the lot. 11 days. $800 wasted. $4,500 more on the table. Harvest waiting. His father's voice in his head. "Merit determines advancement, Frank. Not comfort." 1 hour, Frank said, turning to face Jane. "Ms. Nelson, you have 1 hour to prove your diagnosis. If you're right, we'll know soon enough." Derek's smirk was immediate and cruel. "When she fails, this nonsense ends. We call Des Moines, order the rebuild, and get back to reality." Frank's eyes stayed on Jane. 1 hour, starting now. Jane nodded once, professional and steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She walked to her toolbox, retrieved her diagnostic tablet, and crossed the shop floor toward the 8R. Behind her, 6 men watched, 5 mechanics and 1 operations manager, all witnesses to what would either validate or destroy everything she'd sacrificed to be here. The countdown had begun. Jane connected her diagnostic tablet to the OB2 port beneath the dashboard, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The screen flickered to life, scrolling through system checks. Within 90 seconds, she had what she needed. "Error code P0192, she announced, turning the tablet so Tom could see. "Fuel rail pressure sensor circuit malfunction, stored intermittently over the past 11 days. Derek scoffed from his position by the shop door. "We saw that. Sensor error. We cleared it." "You cleared the symptom," Jane said evenly. "Not the cause." She pulled up the historical data, graph lines spiking and dropping across the screen. "Modern engines have over 50 sensors. They don't lie. They tell stories if you listen. Watch the pattern. Pressure drops occur only under high load conditions, never during shop idle testing." She started the engine. It rumbled to life smoothly. Jane monitored the fuel pressure gauge on her tablet. 45 psi, rock steady. She engaged the PTO, simulating field load. The pressure spiked to 65 psi, held for 3 seconds, then plummeted to 35. The engine coughed, surged, nearly stalled. Tom leaned closer, watching the numbers. "We tested static pressure, never thought to test dynamic response under load." "Fuel pressure regulator," Jane explained, shutting down the engine. "Stuck partially open. Under low load, it compensates fine. High load, it can't maintain regulation, causes intermittent injection starvation." She met Derek's eyes. "That's why it ran perfectly in the shop, but died in the field. You weren't treating the cause, just expensive symptoms." She pulled up the part catalog on her tablet. "Regulator costs $75, not $4,500. Jane located the fuel pressure regulator, a cylindrical component no bigger than a soda can, mounted on the high-pressure fuel rail. 38 minutes remained. She pulled on safety glasses and nitrile gloves. First rule: always depressurize fuel systems before disconnecting lines. Basic safety. She opened the pressure relief valve, listening to the hiss of trapped fuel bleeding off. 4 mounting bolts held the regulator in place. Her movements were precise, efficient, no fumbling, no wasted motion. Each bolt came out in proper sequence to prevent warping the rail. The mechanics had edged closer now, watching technique they recognized as professional. 25 minutes left. Jane cross-referenced the part number on her tablet, confirming the exact replacement. "Frank, you have a runner? Parts in stock at Ag Supply in town, $75. Frank dispatched Kenny immediately. While waiting, Jane inspected the entire fuel system with a small flashlight, running her fingers along connections and hoses. Near the return line, she paused. "Tom, look at this. A slight weep of diesel around an O-ring. This wasn't causing the failure, but it'll be a problem within a month." Tom nodded slowly. "Good catch." 18 minutes when Kenny returned, regulator in hand. Jane installed it carefully, torquing each bolt to specification, 55 feet-pounds, exact sequence. No guessing. She reconnected fuel lines with precise quarter turns, checked every connection twice. Then she opened her tablet, accessed the ECM, and reset the fuel pressure parameters, clearing old error codes, establishing new baseline readings. "How did you know to reset the ECM?" Carl asked, genuine curiosity replacing skepticism. "Computer needs to relearn the system parameters after component replacement," Jane explained, still focused on the screen. "Otherwise it compensates based on the old regulator's failure pattern." Final visual inspection. Every connection secure, no leaks, no loose bolts. Jane stepped back, wiped her hands on a shop rag, and looked at Frank, ready to test. 12 minutes remained when Jane climbed into the cab. The seat was worn smooth by years of operators, the controls familiar beneath her hands. She ran through pre-start checks methodically, instrument cluster glowing green, fuel pressure gauge reading ready, all systems nominal. She turned the key. The starter engaged with a grinding whir. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught with the deep rumble of a 6-cylinder diesel coming to life. Jane watched the gauges. Oil pressure rising steadily to 45 psi, temperature climbing normally through the green zone, no warning lights on the dash. She let it idle for 30 seconds, monitoring her tablet. Fuel pressure held rock steady at 45 psi. Then she engaged the PTO, adding accessory load. The engine's RPM dipped slightly, compensated, held firm. No surge, no hesitation. Jane increased throttle to working RPM. The level Marcus had been running during deep tillage when the tractor failed. Her eyes moved between the dash gauges and her tablet screen. Fuel pressure climbed to 48 psi under load and stayed there. No spike, no drop, no fluctuation. 2 minutes at full load, engine temperature stable, no surging, smooth, consistent power. She throttled down to idle, let it settle, then ran the full cycle again. Perfect. The engine that had defeated 5 mechanics for 11 days was running like it had just rolled off the factory floor. Jane shut down the engine. Silence settled over the shop, broken only by the cooling tick of metal contracting. She climbed out of the cab, coveralls still relatively clean, tablet in hand, expression calm and professional. No celebration, no vindication dance, just quiet competence. She checked her watch, 57 minutes, 3 minutes under deadline. Her eyes found Derek across the shop floor. He stood rigid, face drained of color, jaw clenched tight. Jane held his gaze for 2 seconds. Steady, unflinching, without malice or triumph. Just the look of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had proved it. Then she turned to Frank and nodded once. "It's fixed." Frank Thornhill crossed the shop floor with deliberate steps. He extended his hand to Jane. "Ms. Nelson, that was exceptional diagnostics, textbook systematic troubleshooting." Jane shook his hand, feeling the calluses of 3 generations of agricultural work. "Thank you, Mr. Thornhill." Frank turned, his expression hardening. "Derek, my office. Now." The door closed but didn't muffle everything. Frank's voice carried, firm, uncompromising. Derek's protests came in fragments. "Been here 30 years? Just got lucky." Frank's response was crystal clear. "Unacceptable behavior, public apology required, non-negotiable." 2 minutes later, Derek emerged. His face was crimson, jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. He stopped 3 feet from Jane, words coming out like gravel. "Miss Nelson, I was wrong to dismiss your expertise. A pause, painful and forced. Your diagnostic approach was correct. I apologize. Jane met his eyes with professional grace, no trace of vindication. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Tom Reynolds approached first, weathered face thoughtful. I've been doing this 25 years. Never thought to test dynamic fuel pressure under load. Would you show me the diagnostic process? I want to learn. Carl Santos was next, voice thick with emotion. My daughter's in tech school right now. Agricultural equipment program. I told her it wasn't for women. He shook his head. I need to call her tonight. Marcus Webb held up his phone, grinning sheepishly. That diagnostic tablet, can it read hydraulic sensor data too? Because we've got a planter that's been acting weird. One by one they came, genuine questions replacing skepticism, curiosity replacing doubt. Frank raised his voice to address the entire shop. Effective immediately, Jane Nelson is promoted to lead equipment specialist, $85,000 annual salary, full diagnostic authority, and training responsibility for implementing modern diagnostic systems across our fleet. Derek stood frozen for 3 seconds, then walked toward his office without a word, footsteps heavy on concrete. Jane felt something release in her chest. Validation, vindication, and grief all mixed together. She touched the small pendant under her coveralls, the one with her grandfather's initials engraved on the back. We did it, Grandpa, she whispered. We did it. 6 months changed everything. The combined failure came first. Harvest season, yield monitoring system crashed, 3 days of downtime costing thousands in delayed work. Jane diagnosed corrupted GPS firmware in 40 minutes, reflashed the system in 2 hours. Total cost, $0, just knowledge and the right diagnostic software. 2 weeks later, Marcus brought her the planter with intermittent row unit failures. 4 units dropping seeds inconsistently, no pattern the old troubleshooting could find. Jane traced it to a CAN bus communication error. One faulty connector causing a sensor cascade across the entire system. $150 fix versus the $8,000 in hydraulic components Tom had been ready to replace. Then came the ghost in the auto steer system. Guidance shutting off randomly, no error codes, no visible cause. Jane spent an afternoon with an oscilloscope and found electromagnetic interference from an aftermarket radio someone had installed too close to the GPS antenna. Reposition the antenna. Problem solved. The shop had transformed. Every morning at 7, mechanics gathered for 15-minute diagnostic reviews. Case studies shared, patterns discussed, continuous learning replacing defensive territory guarding. Frank invested in modern diagnostic equipment, and Jane trained every mechanic on the tablet systems. They built digital repair logs, tracking patterns, implementing predictive maintenance protocols that caught problems before they became failures. The results spoke louder than any argument. 70% reduction in diagnostic time, 50% lower parts waste, 80% first-time fix rate. Thornhill Co-op's equipment uptime became the envy of the region. Derek left after 3 months, taking early retirement. His exit interview with Frank was quiet, honest. I felt left behind by the technology, he'd admitted. I let that fear turn into something ugly. Jane proved me wrong about everything. Her competence, modern diagnostics, who belongs in this trade. I respect what she's built here. Tom Reynolds took Derek's position, embracing a hybrid approach, traditional mechanical intuition combined with modern diagnostic precision. Best of both worlds, he called it. The invitation to speak at the Midwest Agricultural Technology Conference came in September. Jane stood on stage before 300 equipment managers and told the story of a $75 part, an hour deadline, and what systematic thinking could accomplish. The standing ovation lasted 2 minutes. Modern Farmer magazine ran a profile in November, breaking barriers with bites and bolts. The photo showed Jane in her shop, diagnostic tablet in one hand, torque wrench in the other, flanked by her mechanics, all of them smiling. 2 female apprentices joined in December. Sarah, 21, fresh from tech school, with nervous energy and brilliant questions. Maya, 19, who'd grown up on a farm and knew machines the way Jane once had. Jane mentored them both, passing forward what Walter had given her. Other co-ops started calling, asking to tour the facility, to learn the diagnostic protocols, to understand how Thornhill had achieved such remarkable efficiency. Frank welcomed them all. The transformation had become a model. Saturday afternoon in late winter, Jane drove to Cedar Rapids, to the cemetery where Walter Nelson rested beneath an oak tree. She knelt beside the headstone, brushed snow from the engraved letters. "Grandpa, you taught me to love these machines when I was 7 years old," she said quietly. "Today, I taught 5 mechanics how to truly listen to them. We're training 2 young women who remind me of myself at their age. The dealership's gone, but what you built, it's still alive." She could almost hear his voice, rough and warm. "Machines talk to those who pay attention. Never stop listening." "I haven't, Grandpa. I never will." She felt peace settle over her, the deep satisfaction of belonging, of earning her place, of opening doors for others. Walter's legacy wasn't lost. It lived in every engine she diagnosed, every mechanic she trained, every barrier she dismantled through quiet, undeniable competence. Frank called a board meeting in March. He stood before the co-op's leadership and proposed formal diversity and merit-based advancement policies, codified in writing, enforceable and clear. "My father built this co-op on the principle that competence has no gender," Frank told them. "I lost sight of that. We're reclaiming it, and we're making sure it never gets lost again." The board approved unanimously. They created an annual award, the Robert Thornhill Progressive Leadership Award, honoring individuals who embodied merit, innovation, and inclusive excellence. The first recipient presented at the spring banquet was Jane Nelson. Frank found her afterward, away from the crowd. "You reminded me who we're supposed to be," he said simply. "Thank you." Golden hour painted the fields orange and gold when Jane and Sarah walked back to the shop after checking the 8R, the same tractor that had started everything. Sarah had been quiet, thoughtful. "Do you ever doubt you made the right choice?" Sarah asked. "Selling your business, coming here, facing all that resistance?" Jane smiled, watching the sun touch the horizon. "Every day for the first 6 months. Not once since that afternoon in the cornfield." "What changed?" "I stopped trying to prove I belonged," Jane said, "and just did the work. The rest followed." They walked together, mentor and apprentice, under a sky ablaze with possibility. Jane pulled out her journal that night, the one she'd kept since technical school, and wrote, "Grandfather once said, the best mechanics don't announce their expertise. Their work does. Today, my work speaks for itself, and it's teaching others to find their voice too. Engines still talk to those who listen. I'm just making sure more people learn the language." She closed the journal, turned off the light, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept and a future opened. Walter Nelson's granddaughter had done more than fix a tractor. She'd changed what was possible. And she was just getting started. If this story of perseverance, expertise, and breaking barriers inspired you, subscribe to hear more stories of people who prove that competence transcends prejudice. One repair, one challenge, one quiet victory at a time.